find out he'll murder you.
If I could, I should have would.
Just stand on the rock where Moses stood.
Rock and Elijah rock.
Shout, shout about
Elijah, Elijah, Elijah rock.
We're gonna shout, shout, shout about
Elijah rock coming up.
Elijah rock coming up.
Set this world on fire.
Yes,
God's gonna set this world on fire one of these days. Hallelujah. God's gonna set this world on fire. God's gonna set this world on fire one of these days. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table. Sit at the welcome table one of these days. Hallelujah. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. I'm gonna eat and never get hungry. I'm gonna eat and never get hungry one of these days. Hallelujah. And never get hungry. I'm going to eat and never get hungry one of these days. I'm going to drink and never get thirsty. I'm going to drink and never get thirsty one of these days. Hallelujah. I'm going to drink and never get thirsty. I'm gonna drink and never get thirsty one of these days. So set this world on fire. God's gonna set this world on fire one of these days. Hallelujah. God's gonna set this world on fire. God's gonna set this world on fire. One of these days.
Following President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War, freed African Americans became a major part of the population in states throughout the South and with the right to vote. Less widely realized except among African Americans themselves, that also meant the right to run for public office. And they did, most notably for the United States Congress, where they could run for House seats or have the right to be appointed to the U.S. Senate by state legislatures in the 19th century before the direct election of U.S. senators. That historic and heroic, but sadly forgotten journey with the potential to transform America for the better began today, February 25th, back in 1870, when, on Friday afternoon, February 25th, 1870, Hiram Revels of Mississippi proudly entered the U.S. Senate chambers and was sworn in to become United States Senator Hiram Revels, the first African American and non-white American ever to serve in the United States Congress. For that ceremony, The Senate chambers was filled to the rafters. Everyone knew how historic a moment this was in American history. And the New York Times, the very next day, its lead story on the front page of the New York Times was the story of Hiram Revels becoming United States Senator Hiram Revels. What took place prior to February 25th informs the complete story and foretells the tragic end to this powerful period in American history. Hiram Revels arrived in Washington, D.C. in January 1870, ready to present his credentials and be sworn in. Except the all-white U.S. Senate of mostly Northerners would not vote to accept his credentials to allow him to be sworn in as United States Senator. There were sometimes violent debates on the Senate floor throughout January and February as to whether or not freed African Americans also had a right to serve in the U.S. Congress. Finally, on February 25th, 1870, Hiram Revels prevailed. Senator Hiram Revels was the first of 22 African Americans to enter Congress between 1870 and 1897. One other U.S. Senator, Blanche Bruce, also from Mississippi, and 20 African American congressmen elected to the House of Representatives by popular vote in their districts, beginning with Congressman Joseph Rainey of South Carolina in December 1870. Many, but not all of these African American pioneers were former slaves, and their individual life stories form a rich tapestry of African American biographies. Their contributions, while in Congress, ranged widely, and many introduced important legislation, and most had additional accomplishments once they left Congress. All of them had to live in constant fear. They were each very notable targets of white Southern supremacists, which brings me to a key part of this story. White supremacists, especially their leaders, considered these 22 African Americans the most dangerous class of Black Americans in the South for obvious reasons. Their potential power to transform the South, especially as an influential caucus in Congress, they would form and become a permanent power center in Congress if their numbers continued to grow. Key goal of white Southern leaders was to discredit these African American members of Congress and use all their influence to prevent more of them being elected. Fear and bigotry were their tools. The result was that after Congressman George White of North Carolina entered Congress in 1897, there was not even one Black congressman elected again until 1929, over 30 years and 15 sessions of Congress later. Finally, another African American, a Northern congressman, Oscar DePriest from Illinois, entered Congress. All African Americans who served in the U.S. Congress prior to 1935 served as Republicans. Back then, the Democratic Party in the South after the Civil War was the party of racism. The first African American to serve in Congress as a Democrat was Congressman Arthur Mitchell, also of Illinois, who was elected in 1934 to serve in the 74th session of Congress. Congratulations and a deep sense of pride and gratitude for these 24 African American congressional pioneers and all the other African American men and women who have served in the U.S. Congress since then, up until this current session of Congress. and all of them follow in the footsteps of the African American congressional pioneers. I hope everyone will commit now and throughout the 21st century that African Americans be adequately and fairly represented in both the United States Congress, both Senate and the House of Representatives. Let this be the legacy to these great African American heroes and pioneers of American history. And finally, in the future, a monument dedicated in Washington, D.C. to the African American congressional pioneers.